Okay, so let's jump over to talking about executive sponsorship here. So we kind of talked about some of the first challenges to determine who you're going to communicate with and what your messages are. You've also got to give, obviously, thought to a thorough stakeholder engagement analysis, which should identify and classify your project stakeholders and analyze their influence on the project, define how to kind of manage their influence, positively or negatively, with the end goal being to win their support. So once you've identified your stakeholders, then you can kind of really start to build out on your communication plan, look at your communication mechanisms and tools that we discussed, and figure out who's going to kind of be responsible for kind of executing on all this stuff. Okay? So we've basically got in terms of your stakeholder engagement process, three documents really that you need to prepare in detail and give some thought to. One, your stakeholder engagement plan, which I just mentioned, the project communication strategy and action plan that I mentioned. And the third piece is really a marketing plan, and people may not have expertise in this. So I would suggest that you seek expertise out to do that. The idea behind a marketing plan is go to market. So if you're going to go to market, you need to figure out what your project outputs are going to be, okay? So if they're going to be particular communication vehicles, you need to figure out how to get those out and get those into the best channel. So your communication person will have an idea on that. A really good marketing person will have an even better idea in terms of doing that. The other little thing that I'll mention has to do with just change management strategies, because all of these overlap with your project communication strategies. And you need to identify the change agents. So there's always people who are going to be part of your stakeholder committee, we'll call them, who are going to be change agents. They just like to see positive change. And there are people who like to see negative change too. Okay, right? Oh, nasty. So you need to identify who's willing to accept support or support you. And keep that in mind in terms of your stakeholder analysis, all right? So regardless of whether the project is public-facing or government-facing, in times of crisis, once again, you've got to look at all your stakeholders and look at senior management to say, hey, if we're having a problem with this, how are we going to mitigate this particular group who is working against us in the tide, okay? The other thing I'll just say, just in terms of key messages here, is to reinforce your key messages that your agency has as a whole. A lot of times we tend to operate in silos, but if you're going out through a communication channel, you may in fact have that right. Take a holistic perspective. So you may actually not be at a level to actually do that, but elevate yourself and actually try and think that way, okay? Because that actually gets you more buy-in from more people at more levels, okay? In terms of stakeholder expectations, for projects to deliver reasonable results, you've got to start with reasonable expectations, right? So your stakeholders need to be engaged early, and that's going to give you some insight in terms of their expectations and their assumptions, and that's how you can start to build your plan. It's always when things are done after the fact, I think, where you run into problems, okay? So stakeholder expectation management really includes getting everyone to agree that the project scope is agreed on, and there's clear agreement from all the business owners that all the project outputs are agreed upon as well, okay? So you need to, once again, it's regular communications and it's proactive communications in order to make this work really well. So a lot of, project managers, fall under the edict of kind of I should say under promise and over deliver, which is usually a good way to do it. You get usually, I don't know too many uncomplicated state or even federal projects from a communication perspective. It's not a bad thing to do. It's always a matter of pulling back, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of setting expectations, but you're always I think from a communications perspective, people are delighted that in fact you may have exceeded those. So you're a hero, and everybody in that communication food chain is a hero as well. So the other thing, just in terms of communication commitment, just a few things for you, because we get into ongoing project managers. So what can you do to maintain consistent, continual stakeholder commitment? So a couple of suggestions here for you. So maintaining the project profile by broadly promoting the project, what the project's doing, and how you're delivering it at every opportunity, okay? Promote the progress made on the project, and not just the activity as well, okay? So get a little out of the task-oriented mode and talk about progress. The other thing here too is reinforce and reiterate the project benefits to specific stakeholders. Okay, I can't say that enough. You know, in advertising, there's an old axiom, and this research still holds true. You know how many times you need to see something actually before you'll act on it? How many times do you think that is? Somebody's? Any guesses? 8, more or less? It's what, 7, but it's pretty close. So the whole point is it's repetition, and I think there's a few cardinal rules in communication. So one is repetition, but the second is consistency over time, okay? And that's what will give you great impact. In terms of challenging the views of opponents, you know, provide information that invalidates their perspective, all right? And address any threats that they may feel from their perspective, okay? Once again, think about change management, because as you're doing this is going to affect what they do. So operationally, how much is this program going to affect them? And that's going to help you articulate your communications. The other thing you need to do is seed the field. And what I mean by that is you've got all of these constituents out here, and you've got a core group of people that you're working with, but there's going to be obviously other influencers out there that are going to get involved over time. So you need their cooperation. So let them, even though they're not currently involved in the project, let them know and seek their advice out or counsel before they actually get involved. So you have an ally, right, as you're progressing. This goes without saying, but establish good communications with your key stakeholders. That goes without saying. The thing is too, and that comes from multiple levels. So the project manager is certainly one person, but you need to do that on multiple levels. And one other thing too, that people tend to do, I see this a little bit more in the corporate arena than I actually do on the public sector side, but it's just the general use of external consultants to kind of validate your methodology or what you're doing, because people tend to believe, consultants, right, more than they do people that are in the trenches. So I see that all the time in the private sector, and I hadn't really thought about it until I actually prepared this presentation. I said, okay, you know. So you tend to fall into that. You know, you tend to fall into that. But if they're doing that, that's probably, if your management team is doing that, that's probably why they're doing that. Okay. Now, the stakeholder power grid. Okay. So everybody, you know, after you've completed the stakeholder classification and you've kind of done a little bit of analysis, take a look at your stakeholder power grid. Put people in those areas. So that gives you kind of a checkpoint of where you kind of go. You want to do this analysis before you do your project communication strategy and before you do your project action plan. Okay? Because this will give you some directional latitude of where you need to go. Okay, let's jump over to assessing your communication plan. So successful communication plans certainly identify your stakeholders, the information you're communicating, and how that information is being communicated. Now, I'm being really prescriptive on all of this stuff because you need to be aware of it. There's a lot of moving pieces here. You need to be aware of them and the influence of each of them, okay? So, you know, a couple, in your communication plan, you should have at least have a few, you know, a couple of these key elements anyway. You know, background, obviously the communication plan, your stakeholder analysis, your clearly articulated objectives, the strategy for going about how you're going to be doing your communication, potential issues and risk, as well as any associated budget figures with this as well, because all of these things have different costs, and that's always an issue. So when you're assessing your communication plan, a couple of key points here. Build your communication and look at your communication plan as a strategy and not simply as an action plan. I think that's probably the most profound thing I can mention to you here. So develop a big picture communication strategy goal. So think of your vision or your mission statement. It may be departmentally, but also in terms of how it ties into what the state needs to do, for example. Clearly define your objectives. So objectives change over time. So articulate those. Don't take those for granted. Identify the critical tactics too you're gonna do. So more specifically, what do you need to do to get where? Okay. So that'll give you some good metrics to see how well you're doing. And then secondly, incorporate a feedback loop. So how are you going to measure your success? Boy, I sound like PMI here. PMI commercial, don't I? So, okay. The second major area, just in terms of your communication assessment, is understanding your communication channels. So recognize the limitation of various channels, right? Some last for a while, others evaporate very quickly, okay? So, and I'll use the example of a tweet is gone, right? Here today, it's only 40 characters. Print, you know, they call it readership, and there's pass along. So that's going to be around for a while. So you really need to think about all of that stuff. So match the channel once again to the desired level of interaction and your feedback needs. Okay, in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Look at multiple channels. I always like to use as many channels as I possibly can. Okay, in order to get something across, because once again, if you take the metric of it takes someone 7 times to see something and you get bombarded by umpteen messages per day, what do I need to do to get that across? Okay, so really think about that. The other last point here is just looking at packaging techniques. Okay, so one cue here is using language of the end user that will aid in your pull-through, okay? So yeah, I'll use the simplistic example here. If it's for a kid, speak like a kid, because the kid will get it, right? So, you know, it's kind of like, you know, the news media in the Washington Post, for example. You get your regular newspaper, you get a kids section, right? Kids section is actually interesting, you know? I mean, it's you know, it's dumbed down, obviously, but you won't find any 6-syllable words. You know, so it's that sort of idea, okay? Think about your communications in terms of constructing them well. So don't be ad hoc, don't shoot from the hip in terms of what you need to do. And the other thing is, and I have fallen into this trap because I've heard myself saying this on many occasions, but don't fall for the lowest common denominator. So you have to make an assumption that there's a knowledge base out there, so you kind of start from there. Okay, that isn't necessarily going to push your agenda forward in terms of your communication, your project activity, right? So give them some homework and then bring them in at a mid-tier level and drag them along.